Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 230. And this week it is Terri's turn to share something. Terri, what do you have?
Well, Daisy, I am going back to a podcast that you and I have discussed before. It is a podcast called Hidden Brain with the host Shankar Vedantam. And this one is about memory. And I think it's funny that last week you did a Jim Kwik episode. And so often his episodes, or when I think of Jim Kwik, I think of memory. But your topic from last week was not about memory. And I think somehow it just kind of sparked my interest in this episode that I found in the Hidden Brain podcast. So this episode is entitled You 2.0, Remember More, Forget Less.
Could do with some of that.
I think we all could do with some of that. And it was kind of funny as I was listening to this, I was thinking about even how I prepare for this podcast. And I think things will come up during this episode. But one of the things they talk about is we overestimate sometimes our ability to remember and we underestimate forgetting. And I do this every week when it's my turn to share something with you. I'm listening and I'm like, oh yeah, I'll just remember that part. And then when I get to share it with you, I'm like, I have no idea what it was that I was going to share with Daisy. So anyway, I think this may be an episode that just points out some things that might be of use to people. So in this episode, he speaks with a guest named Daniel Willingham, who is a cognitive scientist and professor at the University of Virginia, who, of course, is studying memory. So as they get started, he talks about several examples of memory being problematic for people. And I won't even go into the details of who it was or anything, but there was a U.S. presidential debate, and it was within a particular party. So it was a number of people debating, not just two at the end, but 7 candidates debating. And the person said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this for the country. And the first thing I'm going to do is eliminate 3 agencies within the government. And those 3 are commerce, education, and he couldn't think of the third one. And then he fumbled around it for a while. And then he kept repeating. And then at some point, he couldn't remember the other 2. So it's just one of those examples that sometimes not remembering things is in a high pressure situation when remembering would be important. Another example they shared, I guess, made the news. I, of course, had never heard about this, but someone who had a lot of money in Bitcoin, so basically millions of dollars in his Bitcoin account, could not remember his password.
Screwed.
And it has one of those things where if you try to remember your password, you try to log in 10 times, it locks you out for good.
Ouch.
And the funny thing is, well, maybe it's not funny, but interesting thing is he never did remember it. So I don't know if he lost the millions of dollars or not.
Yeah, because it's the only way you can access it. That's the thing, isn't it, with Bitcoin? If you haven't got your passkey, no.
Which I think is kind of maybe brilliant on their part. How many millions of dollars are invested that will never be accessed? Anyway, so just they were talking a little bit about sometimes the importance of being able to remember things and maybe why all of us might want to work on some of these skills. He then went through a couple of examples in his own life where he forgot an important meeting with his advisor in grad school. And he talked about this prospective memory. And that is when you're planning to remember something. And I think that's me when I try to share something with you from the other podcasts. I think, oh yeah, I'll remember to tell Daisy this. And I don't remember that which I thought I would remember. So one of the things they discuss is that oftentimes people think, well, if it's something that is important to me and I want to remember it, I will.
Yeah.
And wanting to remember something, they of course have studied this, and they really find there's no evidence that that helps. It is not about how important is this information to you and whether or not you will remember it, clearly by the Bitcoin passcode. So it's not as simple as, well, if it's valuable, I'll remember.
Yeah, that makes sense, because we remember all sorts of ridiculously useless stuff.
Yes, exactly. And they talked about that one piece of evidence for that is the things we really want to remember, we don't. And the things we had no intent in remembering, we still hold on to 30 years later. Going back to another Hidden Brain episode about chatter that you remember in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
That conversation you had 35 years ago. But another thing they talk about is that memory does not follow our volition or our desire. There's more to it than that. So it's important to kind of learn some skills. They do say that what you think about a lot is more likely to be remembered. But even though what you think about is more likely to be remembered, what and how you think about it is key. I have thought about that conversation 35 years ago hundreds and hundreds of times. That's not necessarily why I'm remembering it. So basically, some people think that, well, if it occupies my mind, clearly I'm going to remember it. But if we are, let's say we want to remember a script for a play, if we're just reading it over and not really paying attention, kind of a shallow running it through our mind, we are not going to remember it. So some of the strategies they talk about are ways to deepen how we're thinking about it so that we can remember. So one thing related to memory that many of us run into is that we have confidence in our memory that we will remember something. So again, let's say, for example, I'm going to deliver a speech. And so I read over the speech 40 times. What we're actually relying on there is not memory, it's actually just familiarity. We're very familiar with that speech because we've read it so many times. But this really is not the type of memory that we typically want. We need to be more than familiar with something. Without connecting the information in our brain, we're going to have a harder time remembering it. And what familiarity does do to help us is it prompts other memory cues. So if you were trying to remember someone's name, let's say, and you see the person and you know who they are, you've seen them before, the familiarity is helpful, but it's going to prompt you to ask yourself some questions. Where do I know that person from? Is that someone from work? Did I see them at a store? Have I ever had a conversation with them? So familiarity helps trigger memory cues, but it really doesn't hold memory with it. So one of the strategies he mentioned related to this kind of familiarity is that to actually remember something, so to remember that speech, we need to practice it with fewer cues required. So we have to get more than familiar with it. And then they went into this whole conversation about actually then what we need to do is almost focus on the parts of the speech that I'm not remembering, the parts of the speech where I'm having difficulties, rather than just saying the same parts that I know over and over again. Focus on the parts that I'm struggling with. The host of the podcast then talked about, he had interviewed Angela Duckworth years ago in her research about grit. And she was talking about spelling bee champions and kind of trying to figure out how did they do this. And one of the things she highlighted is what she called deliberate practice, that they would try to identify their areas of weakness and focus on them rather than, again, their area of strength. And these two men in this episode said that's exactly what we need to work on. Now, obviously, her research was on grit. The fact that they dug into the parts that were more difficult for them, that was focusing on the grit. But the idea that deliberate practice going for the missing pieces, going for the links, going for the kind of weaker spots actually is important in creating good memory. As I mentioned earlier, they also talked about the idea that we tend to discount the impact of forgetting. We have a little bit more confidence in our memory. Dr. Willingham talks about a study that he did looking at memory with information that's really disconnected from people. So they give them some foreign language words and definitions, maybe on flashcards or something, and they practice them for a little while, and the people are scoring like 80%. They're doing really well. So they say, okay, go away for 2 weeks and come back. And how much do you think you're going to remember? And the people think, well, I'm scoring 80% now. I'll score 80% when I come back. And unfortunately, what happens, they come back and it's much lower than 80%. So this is just one of those kind of evidence pieces they use to show oftentimes we over-predict how well we are going to remember. We under-predict how forgetting is going to happen. I do this all the time. I leave one room and think, I'll remember what I'm going there for. And I don't give enough credence to the unfortunate forgetting that I do.
Yes, it's all about how you sort of cement that there, isn't it? It's those kind of things, those thoughts are really ephemeral. Yeah, it's right at the forefront of your mind when you leave one room to go to another room to look for it. But then, squirrel, something distracts you and that's and then it's gone and you've lost it. Unless you've cemented it there in some way.
And I think in many of the pieces they were talking about and what you're touching on now is, I think many of us, as we're trying to learn something well enough to remember it, it's almost like we do the bare minimum and then we think, I've got it. Oh, I'm done. I've practiced it 4 times. I'm good. And what they described is actually over-learning can help because we don't really anticipate the amount of forgetting that will take place. So over-learning, keep practicing it over and over, even though you think you've already got it. And I think that has gotten in my way in the past, is that I think, okay, I've done it enough times, I'm good. And I need much more practice to really solidify it. Also, the degree of challenge we kind of put on the learning to help us remember is important. And he used this example. So he described if someone said to you, hey, Daisy, what you need to do is be able to do a lot of push-ups and do them like this, and then I'm going to come back. You come back the next day, or the person comes back the next day, and you are doing your push-ups on your knees. And the person says, Daisy, what are you doing? And you're like, well, the goal is I have to do more. So they're easier to do if I do them on my knees. So this makes sense, right? But when it comes to the benefit of doing push-ups, it's not the number, it's what you're getting out of it. And if you're not getting as much out of it on your knees, it doesn't matter how many you do. So what many of us do to try to learn things and remember things is that we try to take the easy way out. We do the simpler things and it doesn't really get us to remember that we actually need the right type of challenge. So I'm going to share an example here, and he does talk about this later, but mnemonics. Now, I have this mnemonic device that I still remember, and I actually, while I was thinking about this episode, I looked this up. When I was a kid, we had an early on video game set that you hooked up to your TV. And it was called Odyssey. It came out in 1972. This is the information I had to look up, and I think it came out in the UK in 1974. You had to tape a screen to the TV and then you could do something. Now, I could be totally making this up. This might not have even had anything to do with Odyssey, but that's what I have it connected to. We had a game that was about learning the state capitals. In the US, there are 50 states, and every kid somewhere in school has to know all of the states, where they're located, and what their capitals are. Really important information. So I learned all of the capitals because there was this game, And now I looked this up. There are tons of games to help kids learn them now. But what I remember serves me no good now, because what I remember is face to face, cheek to chica, the capital of Kansas is Topeka. But that has not left my brain. So perhaps I needed to connect the information more deeply, learn more significantly. What is the value of Topeka? What happens in Topeka? Different things like that. So unfortunately, oftentimes we learn the easiest way to remember something, but it doesn't really have meaning for us, even though we might remember it. So one strategy he talked about is organizing the info that you are trying to learn. So you could ask yourself questions during it. Is this true? Why is this true? Even thinking ahead, if you're going to read something for information, ask yourself some questions, maybe based on the headings. What things am I going to learn about this event? Why did this event happen? Why is it important that I know details about this event? And this made me think about my years as a teacher. And I don't know if anyone else ever felt this way, but I always wanted the teacher's guide.
Yeah.
Like that book had all the answers. And if I could just get the teacher's guide. Well, what I found out when I became a teacher is the teacher's guide wasn't really helpful either. But when you would read a chapter for information, let's say it's in a history book or a science book, they would have questions at the end that you had to answer. And I do remember one of my teachers saying, read the questions before you do the reading, so you know what you're reading for. But I realized I, again, shortcutted this. I was just looking for the answers. I didn't care what I was actually reading. I just knew I was going to have to know 3 reasons why, blah, blah, blah. But the more we can ask ourselves questions to organize the information that we're going to have to remember, the better chance that we will remember it.
Yes, I think that's a big thing in Jim Kwik's book, Limitless. Mm-hmm. He talks about that. And I can remember thinking, going back to a lot of my school days and learning, it was all about, you've got to learn this information and then we're going to test you on what you remembered at the end. And it would be cheating to give you those questions at the beginning. And I read it, I think it was just as I was embarking on that Science Foundation course I did. And I read his book and he just turned that, like you've just described, he turned that on its head. And he said, no, go and look at the test paper first, or go and look at the questions at the end of the chapter, or whatever it is. Look at the stuff at the end that you're supposed to be testing what you've remembered, the information that you've retained. Go and look at that first before you start learning, because it's just putting those questions into your mind. You're looking out for things and you learn better. And it did make a real difference, actually, to how well I did learn that information. It's a good strategy.
And I think this touches on what they described as elaborative interrogation. So you're posing questions. What is it that I'm going to learn? Why am I learning this? Why is it important for me to understand this? How does this connect? Because one of the reasons, again, why we struggle oftentimes with kind of rote memorization of information. For me, I can always think of this when it comes to history. You knew the name of the battle, the year of the battle, and the general that won or whatever. But it has no meaning to me.
No.
And so then, unfortunately, depending on how the teacher might ask questions about it, I couldn't answer them. I could just tell you what year, where it was fought, and who won. I didn't know why. I didn't know what it resulted in. And so again, being able to ask yourself deeper questions about learning this information. And they talked about doing it in a way that you want to think more deeply about what you're trying to remember, and basically coordinating information across paragraphs and pages and facts. Because again, what many of us learn to do is just memorize the facts. But if we don't coordinate the meanings of these, the memory won't be as useful. And Dr. Willingham shared an example of looking at an elementary school history lesson or middle school, I don't remember, basically where the teacher was talking about the Underground Railroad in the U.S., which was a system of helping slaves to escape. They read the chapter, they read this concept, and they talked about it. And then the teacher had them make food that the people would eat while traveling on the Underground Railroad. And I guess biscuits were kind of the common food. And so they made biscuits. But when you go back to it, certainly they remember making biscuits. But they spent so much time thinking about measuring and doing this. So again, what your mind is focusing on, you're more likely to remember. They had no idea what the Underground Railroad was about. Why was it happening? What were the struggles? What were the things happened along the way? And I think of many things I did as a teacher. I just kind of bowed my head as I listened to this and thought, I was asking kids the wrong questions. I was just trying to get them to read the material rather than to make sense of the material and remember the importance of it. So instead, maybe giving them an activity that would have them think about what are the challenges that people on the Underground Railroad faced? Why were they running? Why were they trying to escape? If you really want the bigger meaning to be what they carry, rather than, if you measure 1 cup of water and pour it in like this, that isn't going to help. You and I talked about this before when we talked about the memory episode that we did related to Jim Quick, but framing the info that you want to remember in the form of a story. Studies have shown that the story format helps people to remember more because, again, it connects information. It puts it into a tangible connecting structure. Characters in a story also help. So if there are people involved in the information that you need to remember, having them as characters in the story helps. But even if they aren't characters, just having some kind of central theme or conflict, that's how people write books. There's a conflict. There's a thing that has to be resolved. So you could think about this content that you need to remember like a story. The last thing he talked about is kind of knowing why learning this, why remembering this is useful. How will you use the information? And he shared an example of people learning a mathematic equation based on football stats. But then on the test, the question was about cars, maybe distance traveled or something like that. We are likely that our memory tends to cling to the examples we use to learn it. So if I kept going over the football stats example and learning this mathematics equation, I'm going to have a hard time applying it to the car example. So instead of just focusing on the details of the example, really, again, to ask yourself, how am I going to use this information? And when I think of many of us in our school experiences, that's one of the challenges. We never knew how we were going to use this. I still don't understand how knowing about an obtuse angle is going to help me in the world. And so focusing on how this information is going to be used is another important part of creating good memory. Otherwise, we're just clinging again to the examples, and then we can't apply the information.
It's so funny. I was thinking about that as an example earlier when you were talking, that it was something that my O-level maths teacher said to us, because there's a lot of things that you've got to learn and remember with maths, isn't there? And that's something that she said. She said you will use this every day of your life. And okay, that's potentially a bit of an exaggeration, and certainly selective parts of what I learnt in O-level maths I have used, but have used very regularly indeed. What do you use when you want to work out how much paint you need to paint the walls in a room? What do you use when you're working out how many bags of gravel you need to cover the paths and different areas that you've marked out in a garden? You know, how do you work out how many pavers you need to go around the outside of a circular lawn that you're putting in? All these things, that's what you need. And so, yeah, it's something that I use a lot, you know, to know that pi r squared is the area of a circle, 2 pi r is around the outside. You know, they're things that I use all the time. I think that's one of the key things, isn't it? When you use something all the time, when you practice something, especially when you put it into a real practical, useful thing, you just, it's there. You remember it.
It's funny because that also makes me think not only about memory, but just learning. Like you said, the more relevant it feels, the more likely we are to connect with it. And who knows what math teacher, I don't remember a specific, but taught us about percentages or even breaking a percentage into a ratio or whatever, but knowing 20% of something, how do you figure that out? And I think of it regularly when I watch people who have an app on their phone, how to figure out how much to tip at a restaurant. And I always think, wait, that's so obvious. If you tip 20%, that's 1/5. What's 1/5 of your bill? But I realized not everyone learned to think of percentages and ratios that way. Same thing, again, this is money related, but sales. Well, this is only 15% off. And 15% is just awkward to do even in my head. So I want 25%. That's 1/4 off. I can do that in my mind. But again, what's relevant, what we think about, what we use. As I was listening to this episode, another one of those pointless things that I have remembered and think I will remember until my last day is my student number from when I was a student in undergrad. We had to use it for everything. 1081613. Like, I will never forget that number. But every now and then I worry, what other things will I forget? Like here in the US, we have a social security number and it's a 9-digit number. Every now and then somebody will say, what's the last 4 of your social? And I'm like, what if I forget that? What if I, going back to the Bitcoin thing, but it just made me think about all the things that I do remember that I don't need to hold in my brain anymore.
Yeah. Let's get rid of those that we can make way for the useful thing. It doesn't work like
Clear
that.
it out. Yeah. And funny, some friends and I were traveling recently on a weekend trip, and we listened to an episode of this together. It was fun to have them listen to an episode. But at some point in the weekend, I sang a song that I had to memorize in 5th grade from the school play. I was Mother Nature in the play, and I had to sing the song. Now, the reason I sang the song is because one of them was boasting, and that was the theme of this song. So I had to sing her the song to make sure she knew why she shouldn't be boasting. But again, why am I still holding that song? Perhaps it's because I overlearned it. I practiced it so much because I was terrified that I would forget it on stage in front of, 50 people. But I overlearned that song, and it is lodged in my brain still.
Yeah, I think about things like that. I think about things like the brownie pledge. And you go back and you remember, the overlearning, the terror of forgetting, the importance of having to remember everything you have to say. And so the overlearning, and then you never forget it. Mm-hmm. But you could do with a bit of a clear out. Don't need that anymore.
And, I think, again, I sometimes need to go back to some of those ways of remembering, because it's a lot harder to remember new things for me now that I could remember. I used to remember all of my students' names within like the second day of school, and I had probably 120 students. I remember one of my colleagues, we had to team teach one year, and it was like January, and he said, I don't know that kid's name, the one that sits in that row. I'm like, you mean Anthony? Like, how do you not know that kid's name? We're 5 months into the school year, but I don't remember things the way I used to. That old thing, like, I can't remember what I ate for breakfast, and yet I can still remember 1081613. So I just think it's an interesting topic for all of us to be kind of aware of. We can do things to help make the things that we do need to remember something that's more possible for us. And of course, it led me to want to go back and follow Jim Quick some more and get some more of his memory tools.
Yes, definitely, because he does have some really good tips. There were all sorts of other things that I learned from him and applied. And on a practical level, it did make a real big difference to the information that I retained.
Anyway, I thought this was an interesting episode, and it made me think about needing to be a little more strategic in things that I do need to remember. And I don't know, maybe I'll keep using some mental floss to get rid of some of those things that I don't need to remember. But I think this is something that all of us can put to use in some level.
Definitely. Well, until we meet again next time, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.